The smell hit him first. That was what Unteroffizier Klaus Berger remembered years later when he tried to explain to people what that morning had been like. Not the sound, not the sight, but the smell. Cutting oil and hydraulide fluid and something beneath it. Something older and harder to name. The particular iron and grease odor of machinery that never stops running. He was standing just inside the main bay doors of a requisitioned vehicle depot outside Liège, Belgium, on a Tuesday morning in early January of 1945, holding a push broom he had been handed without ceremony by an American corporal who had not looked at him once while handing it over. There were 11 other German prisoners standing in a loose group behind him. All of them had their brooms. None of them had started sweeping yet. What stopped them was not defiance. It was not exhaustion, though they were exhausted. It was something closer to the sensation of a man who opens a door expecting a closet and finds instead that the room on the other side has no far wall. The depot floor stretched out in front of them for a distance that none of them could immediately resolve into a number that felt real. Along its length, in rows of a precision that seemed almost deliberate in its indifference to the men now looking at it, stood American tanks and half-tracks and self-propelled guns and vehicles for which Berger did not have immediate names. Some were intact, some were split open like animals on a table, their running gear and hull plates separated and laid out in sequences that suggested not damage but method. Everywhere there was motion. Men with cutting torches, men with wrenches the length of a forearm, overhead cranes sliding through the upper air with loads hanging from them, swaying slightly, going somewhere specific. The noise was continuous and layered, and it did not vary in a way that suggested any of it was about to stop. Berger looked at the broom in his hands. He looked back at the floor. Something had shifted in the arithmetic he had been carrying in his head since the Ardennes, though he could not yet say precisely what it was. Part 1. The Arithmetic of Replacement. The German army that launched itself into the Ardennes on the 16th of December 1944 did not do so because its commanders believed they would win the war. The officers who planned Unternehmen Wacht am Rhein, Operation Watch on the Rhine, were not, by and large, deluded men. They were professionals. Many of them had been fighting since 1939. They had seen Poland and France and the opening months of the Eastern Front. They understood war as a material problem as much as a tactical one. What they were attempting in the Ardennes was not a plan to defeat the United States of America. It was a plan to change the terms of the conversation. The logic, stripped to its bones, worked like this. If the Germans could drive a wedge through the Allied lines, reach the Belgian port of Antwerp, and encircle 4 Allied armies in the process, the shock to Allied morale and the political disruption to the coalition might force a negotiated peace on the Western Front. Germany could then concentrate everything against the Soviet advance in the East. It was a gamble of the most extreme kind. The kind of gamble you make when you know the alternative is slow, certain defeat. Stop and think about what that means. By December of 1944, the German High Command was planning operations not to win the war, but to buy time. The distinction matters enormously for what those prisoners saw inside that depot. The German attack on the 16th of December achieved total surprise. This is one of the more remarkable facts of the entire Western campaign. American forces in the Ardennes region were using it primarily as a rest area for the US First Army, a quiet sector, a place to rotate tired divisions and give them time to reconstitute. The attack hit them at their most unprepared. In the first days, it worked. German armor punched through American lines. Villages fell. American units were cut off, surrounded, forced to surrender or fight their way out. The weather was bad enough to ground Allied air power. For a brief window, the Ardennes looked like it might become something the German army had not produced in years, a genuine operational success on the Western Front. But here is the thing about surprise. It is a one-time expenditure. You spend it once, and then the other side wakes up. And when the American side woke up, it did so in a way that the German planners had not fully accounted for. Not because they were stupid, but because the scale of what they were dealing with was genuinely difficult to believe, even when you had the numbers in front of you. The American Army moved. Not just units, not just reserves. The entire logistical apparatus of the Western Allied effort shifted, rotated, redirected itself toward the Ardennes within days. Divisions that had been resting moved out. Supply columns that had been running on one axis turned and ran on another. The speed of the American logistical response to the bulge, and it would come to be called the bulge, that westward protrusion in the Allied line, was by any objective measure extraordinary. But logistics does not happen by itself. It happens in places, specific, physical places, where men work on machines and put broken things back together. It happens in depots. The American Army of 1944 and 45 operated a system of ordnance maintenance and repair that most German officers, even well-informed ones, had not fully grasped. Not because the information was hidden. Parts of it were visible in captured documents, in the equipment they encountered on the battlefield, in the sheer volume of American materiel they found when they overran positions. But understanding a system from fragments is different from standing inside it. The prisoners who were ordered to sweep that depot in January of 1945 were not standing inside a fragment. They were standing inside the whole thing. Part 2. What the system looked like from the outside. To understand what those prisoners encountered, you need to understand what the American tank maintenance system was designed to do, and how different that design was from anything the German military had built. The German approach to armored vehicle maintenance was, in many ways, a reflection of German industrial philosophy more broadly. It was oriented toward craft, toward quality, toward the specific and the irreplaceable. German tanks. The Panther at 44 tons, with its long-barreled 75mm gun. The Tiger at 54 tons, with its 88mm cannon, were formidable machines. They were also extraordinarily complex ones. The Panther's final drive was a chronic weakness. The Tiger's running gear, with its interleaved road wheels, was a maintenance nightmare in mud and freezing temperatures. These vehicles required skilled attention. They required men who understood them deeply. And when they broke down, which they did, constantly, at rates that shocked even their own crews, getting them back into service was a slow, specialized, often impossible process, far from a proper workshop. The American system started from a different assumption entirely. It started from the assumption that vehicles would break down, that they would be damaged, that some of them would be destroyed, and that the correct response to this was not to build fewer, better vehicles that were harder to replace, but to build more vehicles that were easier to repair, and then to build the repair system so large and so capable that it could absorb damage at whatever rate the battlefield produced it. This was not an accident of American industrial culture, though American industrial culture certainly shaped it. It was a deliberate doctrinal choice, worked out over years of planning and refined through the experience of North Africa and Italy and the first months of the Northwest Europe campaign. The American ordnance system in the European theatre operated on 3 tiers. The first tier was unit-level maintenance, the mechanics attached directly to tank battalions and armoured divisions, who could perform field repairs, replace tracks, swap out engines in the field if necessary. The second tier was the direct support maintenance company, which could handle more extensive repairs, transmission replacements, gun tube changes, electrical system work. The third tier was the general support depot, the largest fixed installations, capable of complete vehicle rebuilds from the frame up. Hold that last phrase, complete vehicle rebuilds from the frame up. What that meant in practice was this. A Sherman tank that arrived at a general support depot could arrive as a burned-out hull, the crew gone, the interior gutted by fire, the engine destroyed, the gun damaged or missing, and leave as a functioning combat vehicle. Not a patched-up, barely running approximation of a tank, a functioning combat vehicle, ready to be issued to a crew and sent back to the front. The Germans could do this too, in theory. In practice, by January of 1945, they could barely do it at all. Their depots in the West were under constant Allied air attack. Their supply lines were stretched and interdicted. The specialized parts their complex vehicles required were increasingly difficult to obtain. A tiger that broke down 20 kilometers behind the front line in the winter of '45 had a reasonable chance of never moving again, not because it couldn't be fixed, but because the system that would have fixed it had been ground down to the point where it could no longer function reliably. The Americans had the opposite problem. They had more capacity than they sometimes had vehicles to fill it. Now meet the men who were sent to sweep it. Men who found themselves in that Belgian depot in January of 1945 were not a random sample of the German army. The Battle of the Bulge had consumed enormous quantities of German manpower. The offensive that had achieved total surprise on the 16th of December had, by the time it was stopped and reversed, cost the German army somewhere between 60,000 and 100,000 casualties, depending on how the accounting was done, with additional tens of thousands taken prisoner. Soldiers who ended up as prisoners in the weeks following the Bulge included men from some of the units that had been in the heaviest fighting. Among them, according to accounts collected by American intelligence officers in the months following the campaign, were men with technical backgrounds, mechanics, engineers, men who had worked on vehicles, men who knew what a maintenance depot looked like from the inside because they had worked in German ones. These were exactly the wrong men to send to sweep an American depot if you wanted to keep its capabilities a secret. And the Americans, it appears, were not particularly worried about keeping it a secret. The prisoners were put to work doing what prisoner labor was put to work doing throughout the European theater: cleaning, carrying, moving things, performing the unskilled physical labor that kept large installations functioning. They were not supposed to be conducting industrial assessments. But men with technical training do not stop being technically trained because they are holding brooms. Sergeant Wilhelm Hartmann, 26 years old, from Düsseldorf, a former automotive mechanic who had been conscripted in 1942 and served as a vehicle maintenance specialist in a Panzer Grenadier division before being captured in the confusion of the Ardennes retreat. Later described in an interrogation conducted by American intelligence officers in February of 1945, what he had seen during 3 days of work detail at an ordnance depot somewhere in Belgium. The interrogation record has him speaking carefully, choosing his words with the deliberateness of a man who has spent time thinking about what he observed. "I have worked in workshops," he said, according to the transcript. "I know what a workshop looks like when it is busy and what it looks like when it is pretending to be busy. This one was busy." Hartmann's account is one of several collected by American intelligence during this period. The details across them are consistent enough to be instructive. Part 3. The floor of the depot. What Hartmann and the other prisoners saw when they were walked through the depot doors was, first, space. German maintenance facilities in 1944 and 45 were cramped by necessity. Space in Germany and German-occupied territory was increasingly contested by Allied bombers, by the advancing front lines, by the competing demands of a war economy that was trying to do too many things with too few resources. German workshops were often improvised, commandeered factory buildings, farm structures, rail yards adapted for vehicle work. They were functional, they were not spacious. The American depot was spacious in a way that struck the prisoners as almost aggressive. Not wasteful, the space was organized, every section of the floor devoted to a specific function. But the sheer square footage of it communicated something before a single piece of equipment had been examined. It communicated permanence. It communicated the assumption that this operation would continue for as long as it needed to continue, and that the space to do so had been planned from the beginning. The floor was divided into bays. Each bay handled a specific phase of the repair process. There were receiving bays where damaged vehicles came in, tracked in on their own power if they could manage it, or delivered on tank transporters if they could not. There were teardown bays where vehicles were stripped to their major components. There were component repair sections, one for engines, one for transmissions, one for running gear, one for electrical systems, one for armament. And there were reassembly bays where the repaired components came back together into complete vehicles. This is the key detail. Read it again carefully. The depot was not fixing damaged parts and reinstalling them in the same vehicle. It was operating a flow system. Damaged engines came out and went to the engine section. Rebuilt engines, not the same engines, rebuilt engines from the pool, went back into vehicles waiting in the reassembly bay. The vehicle that arrived damaged did not wait for its own components to be repaired. It was given new ones, or rebuilt ones, from inventory. Its damaged components went into the repair pool and eventually came out the other side as rebuilt components that would go into the next vehicle. This meant the throughput of the facility was not limited by the repair time of any individual component. It was limited by the overall capacity of the system, and the system had been designed to have very high capacity indeed. Hartman, when the American interrogation officer asked him to estimate the number of vehicles he had seen in various stages of repair during his 3 days on work detail, paused for a long moment before answering. His estimate, recorded in the transcript, was between 80 and 120 vehicles in various stages of the repair process at any given time. He acknowledged that he could not see the entire facility and that his estimate was based on what was visible from the areas where he was working. Hold that number, 80 to 120 vehicles, in one depot, in various stages of repair, at one time. The German 6th Panzer Army, which had been the primary striking force of the Ardennes offensive, had begun the operation with approximately 500 tanks and assault guns across all its formations. By the time the offensive was stopped, it had lost a significant portion of that force to Allied action, to mechanical breakdown, to fuel shortages that left vehicles stranded and then destroyed by their own crews to prevent capture. The recovery rate for knocked-out German armour during the Bulge was far lower than the Americans. German recovery vehicles were fewer. German recovery operations were more frequently interrupted by air attack or the simple impossibility of reaching vehicles in contested terrain. The Americans, meanwhile, were feeding damaged vehicles into a system that could process 80 to 120 of them simultaneously and return them to service. What the prisoners were looking at was an asymmetry, not just the number of tanks the Americans had, the rate at which they could reconstitute tanks they had already lost. There was a sergeant first class named Raymond Kowalski, 29 years old, from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, a former steel worker who had joined the army in 1942 and spent 2 years in ordnance before being assigned to depot operations in the European theatre. Kowalski ran one of the engine rebuild sections in a general support depot in Belgium during the winter of 1944 and 45. His section's job was to take Ford GAA V8 engines, the power plant used in the M4 Sherman, and return them to serviceable condition. The Ford GAA produced approximately 500 horsepower. It weighed roughly 900 pounds. It was, by the standards of the time, a reasonably complex piece of machinery. Kowalski's section was processing between 12 and 18 engines per week during the peak of the Bulge period, according to depot records from that period. That was his section alone. The depot had other sections doing the same work with transmissions, with final drives, with the vertical volute spring suspension assemblies that kept the Sherman's tracks running. 12 to 18 engines per week, in one section, in one depot. The prisoners could not have known Kowalski's specific numbers, but they could see the engines. They could see the organized rows of components waiting for work and the organized rows of completed components waiting to be installed. They could see the rate at which vehicles moved through the bays, coming in damaged, going out repaired. If you have ever worked in a workshop, if you understand the rhythm of that kind of work, you can read a facility the way a musician can read a score. You can hear whether the operation is in tempo or struggling to keep up. You can tell whether the men know what they are doing or are improvising under pressure. What Hartman described, in his careful, considered way, was a facility in tempo. They were not hurrying, he said in the interrogation transcript. They did not look like men who were worried about whether they had enough of something. They looked like men doing a job they had done many times. That observation, from a man who had spent years working in German vehicle maintenance, who knew what worry looked like in a workshop, is worth more than any single statistic. If this investigation is giving you a clearer picture of what American industrial capacity actually looked like from the inside, not the version that survived in the official histories, but the version that a German mechanic recorded when he thought he was just answering questions about where he had been, press the like button. It helps keep this kind of history visible a little longer, and it matters. Part 4. The Forensic Verdict. Here is the forensic verdict of this investigation. Those who swept that Belgian depot in January of 1945 were not witnessing American wealth. They were witnessing American system design. The distinction is not semantic. Wealth can be squandered. Wealth can be misallocated. Wealth can exist in enormous quantities and still produce a military force that is unable to translate it into battlefield effectiveness. There are historical examples enough of exactly that. What the American ordnance system represented was not simply the application of American industrial output to the problem of tank maintenance. It was the deliberate, planned, carefully worked out solution to a specific military problem. How do you keep an armored force in the field when the other side is doing everything it can to destroy that force? The answer the Americans had developed was not to make tanks that were harder to destroy. The Sherman was not harder to destroy than the Panther or the Tiger. Anyone who had fought both knew that. The Sherman caught fire more easily, its armor was thinner, its gun, in the early versions, was outranged by the German long-barreled weapons it encountered. American tankers knew this. They fought in Shermans anyway, in part because they had to, and in part because they understood, or came to understand, that the tank they were in was not the only variable in the equation. The other variable was the system behind them. A Panther that was knocked out in the Ardennes in December of 1944 had, depending on where it fell and what condition it was in, a relatively low probability of returning to combat. German recovery operations were disrupted by Allied air supremacy, the same air supremacy that the bad weather of the Bulge's opening days had temporarily suppressed. German repair facilities in the West were operating under constant threat. German supply lines for spare parts were interdicted and overstretched. The German army was trying to maintain a fleet of vehicles of extraordinary mechanical complexity, with a logistics system that was coming apart at the seams. A Sherman that was knocked out in the same period and recovered, not destroyed outright, but knocked out and recoverable, had a substantially higher probability of returning to combat, because behind it was a system that had been designed, from the beginning, to return it. The Battle of the Bulge, which ran from the 16th of December 1944 to the 25th of January 1945, is usually described in terms of its dramatic human elements: the encirclement at Bastogne, the relief by Patton's Third Army, the fog and cold and confusion of the opening German attack. These elements are real and they matter. But underneath them, running continuously through the entire 41 days of the battle, was a logistical contest that was never really in doubt. The Germans had committed their reserves, they had committed their fuel, and they had not committed enough of it, a miscalculation that stranded armoured columns before they reached their objectives. They had committed their best remaining units in the West, and they had done all of this against an opponent whose capacity to reconstitute damaged forces was operating at a level they had not fully measured. Operation Market Garden, fought in September of 1944, 3 months before the Bulge, had deployed approximately 35,000 to 40,000 airborne soldiers and 50,000 land force soldiers, with approximately 800 tanks in the Garden component alone. The scale of Allied mechanized operations in this period was simply without precedent in the German army's experience. The Germans had fought large armoured battles. They had not fought against an opponent who could sustain armoured operations at this scale, replace losses at this rate, and repair damaged vehicles through a system of this capacity. Hartmann, when his interrogation was concluding, was asked a direct question by the American officer conducting the session. The question, as recorded in the transcript, was, "When you were working in the depot, what did you think?" His answer, recorded in translation, was 5 words. "I thought, we cannot win. Not because of the tanks, not because of the men, because of the floor, because of what the floor was doing, and the rate at which it was doing it, and the complete absence on that floor of any sign that it might stop." The German officers who planned Unternehmen Wacht am Rhein had understood, in the abstract, that American industrial capacity was enormous. They had the numbers, they had the intelligence reports, they had captured documents and prisoner interrogations, and aerial reconnaissance photographs that showed the scale of Allied supply operations. They were not ignorant men. But there is a difference between knowing a number and understanding what that number means in physical space. There is a difference between reading that the Americans can process 100 damaged vehicles simultaneously and walking through the building where it is happening. Every man sweeping that depot understood the difference. They were holding brooms, and they were conducting the most precise intelligence assessment of the war, not because they were trained analysts, but because they were trained mechanics. They knew what they were looking at. They knew what it meant. What it meant was this: the Americans were not fighting to survive the winter. They were fighting on a schedule. They had planned for the bulge, not specifically, not the particular shape of the German attack, but the general problem of armoured combat in Western Europe and the attrition it would produce. They had built the system to handle that attrition before the attrition arrived. And now the attrition had arrived, and the system was handling it, exactly as designed. Wilhelm Hartmann was released from American captivity in the summer of 1945, after the German surrender in May. He returned to Düsseldorf, which was in the British occupation zone. He went back to work as an automotive mechanic. He lived until 1988, dying at the age of 69. In the 43 years between his release from captivity and his death, he was, by the account of people who knew him, not a man who talked much about the war. But the interrogation transcript survives. 5 words in translation, recorded by an American officer in February of 1945 in a room somewhere in Belgium, while outside the last German offensive in the West was being rolled back toward the German border. I thought, we cannot win. Raymond Kowalski came home to Pittsburgh in the fall of 1945. He went back to the steel industry, then spent 30 years working in manufacturing management. He died in 1991 at the age of 75. He is buried in Allegheny County, Pennsylvania. His engine section processed, by the depot's own records for the period of the bulge, 231 Ford GAA engines between the 16th of December 1944 and the 25th of January 1945. 231 engines, in 41 days, in one section, in one depot. Think about what that means for a moment. Really think about it. The men with the brooms thought about it. They had no choice. It was right in front of them. What the history of the bulge sometimes loses in the drama of Bastogne and the weather and the armoured thrusts and the tactical decisions made by exhausted men on both sides is this: the outcome was, in a significant sense, already determined by the time the German attack began. Not because the Americans were invincible, not because the German plan was obviously doomed, but because one side had built a system capable of sustaining the fight indefinitely, and the other side had not. The German army in the West in December of 1944 was a force making one last expenditure of stored energy. The American army was a force running on infrastructure. Infrastructure does not make for dramatic history. It does not produce the kind of stories that get told at reunions or turned into films. It produces depots. It produces engine rebuild sections. It produces men like Raymond Kowalski, processing 231 engines in 41 days. And it produces prisoners with brooms, walking slowly through buildings that smell of oil and cold metal and burnt rubber, looking at the floor with the eyes of men who understand what they are seeing, and arriving at conclusions that no interrogation officer had to prompt them toward. The building told them everything. They swept it anyway. If this investigation gave you something, press the like button. Subscribe if you want the next chapter. And remember, the most decisive weapon in a long war is not always the one that fires. Sometimes it is the one that puts the other weapons back together, again and again, until the other side runs out of things to put back together with. The smell of oil and cold metal, January 1945. A group of men in grey-green uniforms moving through a building with brooms. They were looking at the floor. The floor was the answer.